I have to say, finally, the Australian delegation was a great disappointment, I think, in the negotiations. I was in the rooms, where the Minister Combe was there, and basically whenever the US said something, he would agree to that. And of course with the US not wishing to do anything, agreeing to not wishing to do anything wasn't a very progressive position for Australia to deal with. So there's some of the sort of the insights into this negotiation process. It's not very inspiring to be involved in this process at the moment, particularly when you're representing a country whose future is very uncertain. But hopefully things will move. Hopefully we will make some progress on getting a new agreement. But we really have to find some way of pushing aside some key countries like the United States. I was asked this morning when I did an interview with the ABC about implications for Australia, because clearly the circumstances we're seeing in the US, where we're seeing big money dictating policy, is exactly what our minister has been saying. Well, our minister's been saying about the big mining money as well, and the power of big mining money, and we have to be very aware of that fact. That are our views being properly represented, or is big money running a lot of the agenda of this country? Also, I was asked about the carbon tax. Clearly, we have to put a price on carbon. It's a pollutant. We have to put some sort of price on it, to pick up the costs of the impacts that we're going to deal with. But it has to be some system that is hypothecated. So whatever money the government makes out of this sort of carbon tax, it puts back into addressing climate change. It has to be, to deal with promoting renewable energy technologies and helping us adapt to the impacts of climate change. So that's a bit of an insight into the Durban process. It's not a very rosy picture I'm painting at the moment, and that's the unfortunate state of the international affairs with climate change. But hopefully things will pick up. And with that, I'm quite happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Ian. I'll ask the first question. I'll ask two. One, you rightly expressed concern about 2 degrees, saying, well, 2 degrees is no fun for countries like Tuvalu. But frankly, we've got Buckley's chance of getting to 2 degrees with the trajectories we're on. So I guess I'm interested in your thoughts on both the dangers of admitting 2 degrees is good enough and accepting the consequences of that, but simultaneously we've got an environment movement and a political class that's pretending that somehow, in some form of statistical fluke, we might still, have some glimmer of hope of meeting that least ambitious objective. So I guess I'm just interested in your thoughts on the politics of 2 degrees or the politics of 350 or those sorts of things, because I think there's a real tension in people's minds between the politics of hope and the politics of fear, and I fear that neither of those engage with the politics of reality. We're having this hypothetical talk about messaging when actually, we're on trajectories that are chugging off into very dangerous territory. So without wanting to sound sympathetic to the people of Kiribati or Tuvalu, what should someone like me be saying, and what should people here be thinking about targets and what we should still be aiming for?
Well, yeah, the 2 degrees came out of, basically Europe. They introduced the sort of 2 degrees based on the science at the time, and a lot of NGOs followed in suit with that 2 degrees. But and so it sets a sort of framework for framing the discussions, but it clearly is a temperature that is too high. So, a discussion of 2 degrees is unsatisfactory, and that was one of the reasons we rejected the Copenhagen Accord, because it made a reference to 2 degrees. And Tuvalu was not going to sign on to a document which basically said, we agree that we're going to disappear. unfortunately, it's become part of the language of climate change now. 2 degrees is what we're looking for as a sort of basis for any action. Unfortunately, the United Nations Environment Programme came out with a report last year called the GAP report, which says the pledges on the table now that have come out of Copenhagen and Cancun won't even get us to 2 degrees. We'll overshoot that dramatically. So we're in a really awkward position.
Yeah. Thanks for your talk. Absolutely fantastic analysis that you've given us. But just to take up that 2 degree position, that maybe somewhere many years ago there was some basis in the science of saying go to 2 degrees, but I'm quite certain that NASA and the Potsdam Institute and other places are actually now saying that 2 degrees is too high, that we're going to overshoot that very clearly. In fact, we're going to hit 4 degrees sometime in the second half of this century. In fact, the really pessimistic view is that it might even happen, might hit 4 degrees by 2040, which is incredibly scary given what the consequences are going to be. So the situation is unbelievably grim, and it's so grim that it's really hard to know, how do we go forward? How do we somehow make some significant breakthroughs internationally to stop this situation from occurring? Some more comment, I suppose.
Yes, that's right. Well, that's right. And the Potsdam, does give a lot of scientific guidance to the Alliance of Small Island States, and they were saying clearly that 2 degrees is too high. And they were part of the people who produced, this UNEP GAP report and a subsequent report, and this UNCTAD report that's just come out has said, we're in a very dangerous projection now, which is going to well above the 2 degrees. And we for a country like Tuvalu, we don't even like talking about 2 degrees, because it spells the end of that country.
Brian here. How do you deal with intransigent right-wing Yanks?
Well, this is the real challenge, because of this sort of state of play of the politics of the United States, where so much money is going into the election campaign. It's a country out of control. It's lost its democracy basically by the state of its sort of snowballing this effect of the elections becoming more and more and more expensive. They're now saying that the next presidential campaign is likely to cost $6 billion. And that's extraordinary. So how do you deal with that? And I don't know. We've got to find ways of sort of, to the people of America, you've got to stop this somehow.
Were you talking about trying to isolate America? Are there any signs of hope? Is anyone finding a successful way to debate these guys?
Well, I guess there's certainly sort of trade debates going on. Certainly the EU with its levy on aviation, all flights coming to Europe are now face a tax, and so there are debates going on in the World Trade Organization. The US has joined with Russia and others to sort of challenge that levy. But there are actions that countries can do to sort of isolate the US, economically, I guess. Certainly the EU and China are doing a lot of bilateral deals on renewable energy. China is now the biggest producer of photovoltaic electricity production in the world. So, there's ways of trying to, isolate the United States, I guess.
There's a question up here.
Yeah, so I guess my question touched on that a lot as well. It sounded like basically the best solution that you were suggesting was trade restrictions, and I was just wondering whether there's been any discussion in the WTO about that and how that's looking in terms of there's quite often that tension there with the WTO not wanting that sort of trade restriction. Yeah,
I mean that's a real challenge. I mean Europe's been looking at sort of imports of goods, and trying to look at embedded emissions within the imports and trying to place restrictions on that, and I think we have to look more at those sorts of actions, I guess. But it's a wherever they move, they face challenge, in those areas.
Karen?
Given all of this, what's Tuvalu planning to do? The future's not looking that great.
Well, I attended a sort of a climate change summit in Tuvalu last year, and where the communities from all the islands came together and discussed this, and it's a really tough issue to discuss. There were discussions about migration and things like that, but you've got a country who's got a culture, of people, have their own language, etc., and they don't want to talk about migration, basically. And so there's still, an underlying hope that, that something will happen, and so they remain positive in that sense. But clearly they're looking at other options, and certainly Kiribati is looking at that. They're looking at sort of training programs to help Kiribati people, build up skills in some sort of industries that will allow them to migrate without them becoming second-class citizens. Because this is a real fear, that if they're forced into migration, they'll just become second-class citizens somewhere else.
And thanks for talking. It was very interesting. So you talked a lot about the US. I think you might have missed one of the key points, as I understand it, which is a barrier for them to committing further, which is they have to pass any international agreement through the Senate or through Congress, which is obviously difficult given it's quite a hostile Congress. And for the foreseeable future, I think it was as well, which is maybe why 2020 for them is seen like a more realistic timeline. And I suppose, and the second point is, you talked a lot about the US, but I didn't really hear you talk about India, which, as I understand it, India was the one who was responsible for inserting that language or other agreement with legal force at the end there. So, would you like to talk about that?
Right. So from a legal context or a constitutional context, the US cannot sign on to a legal agreement unless it has domestic legislation. That's basically the situation of its constitution. It can, but it will face challenges, legal challenges, if it does. And so without domestic climate change legislation, the US is unable to sign onto agreement. So the easiest way to resolve that is to say, well, let's put off a process of coming to a conclusion to a legally binding agreement until 2020. And so that's basically what the US is saying. And of course, how many presidents will there be, or presidential elections will there be before 2020? So that, it was delaying, any obligation for the Obama regime to even think about if they get in the next round, whether they can get enough support to get a Climate Change Act through. I mean, it was looking okay for a while. It got through the lower house, was blocked by the Senate. The original Waxman-Markey bill was blocked. But now, with the Republicans got a majority in both houses, it's even less likely. And so they were sort of putting it off. And I guess you've got this sort of domino effect. India and China are saying, our per capita emissions are much lower than the United States. So why are you putting pressure on us to bind us to reducing emissions when the United States is not going to do anything? And it's a sort of domino effect. They're saying, and the Indian Environment Minister gave a very emotive speech in this ministerial roundtable, basically saying we are still have large problems of poverty, and our priority is development. And we will try and develop with a clean energy future, but you can't, as an international community, tell us, to be bound by targets and timeframes if the United States is not going to do anything. And it's this sort of equity debate, I guess.
I suppose the US was saying that they would be prepared to be bound, and India was the only one who was saying we're not.
Well, only by 2020, and if you look at the language that was agreed upon, the US was involved in that discussion about all legal form as well. So they weren't locked into agreeing to a legally binding agreement, and they certainly weren't agreeable to a 2015 timeframe, and they were quite happy for India to be the scapegoat on that issue. But Todd Stern was saying we do not need a legally binding agreement till 2020, and even if then we don't necessarily need it. Let's think about it, was what he was saying. Let's think about a legally binding agreement in 2020. That was what his message was.
And sorry, just to interject on that, I mean, bit of context, 1992 Rio Earth Summit, the principles that we agreed to, 1992, were that climate change was real, 1992, that it was caused by, it was human-induced from burning fossil fuels, 1992, that the best way to tackle it was to introduce a price, 1992, and rich countries should act first. And that wasn't the small print, that was a principle. Because what we were supposed to do in 1993 was introduce a price. And what we were supposed to have done by now was figure out how to have a low carbon economy so that by the time China and India got to where they are now, they could copy us. But we squibbed it. We didn't do anything for 20 years. And now we're saying to poor countries, hey, you know, you got to choose between poverty and saving the planet. So look, I think China and India have to take on obligations, but if we'd have done what we said we were going to do 20 years ago, it would be a lot easier for them to leapfrog. Sorry, there was a question here.
Hello, my name's Karen, and I'm here representing Clean Energy Fraternity. Philippa Rowland was at Copenhagen, and she came back very, very disappointed. I'm wondering if you've had any engagement with Native Americans and have some idea of their way of dealing with the American government. I've had a bit to do with them, and their suggestion is to bypass governments and to deal with the corporations which manage governments and fund governments, and so to have some sort of engagement with those corporations rather than with countries, and to get the 50 or 100 most polluting corporations in the world to engage and to come up with policies for climate change. I've got a lot of respect for you. Thank you so much for coming to us.
Yes, I mean, the lot of issues within that, I guess. Certainly, I attended a meeting last year in Mexico with indigenous peoples to talk about red issues, because there was a real concern, particularly amongst Native American people, about the red being a new form of carbon market that would appropriate their land. So there was a real concern about that. So, you know, I haven't engaged in discussions about with Native American people meeting with corporations and sort of, you know, having that discussion. But I certainly had that discussion about the red issue, and there was certainly clearly a real concern about this. This could be a new way of appropriating their land because of the carbon market. So, you know, it's a challenge.
Well, obviously the current way of dealing with the problem isn't working, so it needs to be reinvented.
Yes, I mean, obviously, you know, because Native Americans have constitutional rights over their land, much more than what we have here. You know, we're seeing that sort of engagement. You know, that if a corporation wants to use their land, then they have to engage in that sort of dialogue. That certainly doesn't happen here, you know, and obviously that's the sort of intent behind that sort of discussion, is that if corporations want to use Native American land, then they have to be engaged in the discussion.
I mean, it sounds to me like, you know, the policy is not really a solution in terms of what you say about, you know, corporations driving policy in the States, and you know, our polity here becoming, you know, more and more presidential, as you say, and in that I'd throw in that you've got a Labor Party that seems to be only concerned about the next poll, and that in regards to, you know, swinging seats and nowhere else, and not bothering to educate the populace at all these days. You know, it's just reacting to polls. And here I'm thinking that, you know, those of us who know better, I think, have to sort of bypass, you know, that polity and go essentially to the people And here I'm thinking of, you know, the climate action movement, such as it is, and we've got a local chapter here in Climate Action Canberra, but also, you know, I'm thinking, I'm doing studying a Master of Climate Change at the ANU. I'm thinking in retirement, which is not far away from me, to cruise around Australia and do climate impact statements to government, saying, you know, this is what's going to happen in your area, because I think people understand there's going to be climate change, but they don't understand what it's going to do to them in their local area. And here I'm talking about also impacts on industries and employment, such as we've seen in the Queensland floods, etc. You know, like,
yeah,
take it to the people.
Richard might want to talk about that. He's just come back from Queensland and having that sort of discussion, I guess, is that, you know, you've got this sort of dichotomy between industries that are going to be seriously affected by climate change. The tourism industry, you know, the people who make their money off the barrier reef are going to be affected by climate change. Yet you've got the coal industry sort of, you know, dominating the sort of economics of that state, you know, and there isn't that sort of discussion. Maybe you want to throw in on that.
Well, just quickly, and another question for you. So the Australian Institute's been doing a lot of work on the mining boom, as you might be aware, and I've just been up in Queensland last night, going up to Brisbane next week, to talk about the impact of the mining boom, in particular on the tourism industry, but also agriculture, manufacturing, education. These other industries are being decimated by the high exchange rate, and the high exchange rate's being driven by the mining boom. And the link to climate change is obvious, well, it should be obvious, but it doesn't get the attention I think it deserves. Australia currently pulls out 400 million tonnes of coal a year. We're currently planning to get to 1 billion tonnes in the next 2 decades. And more than double our coal output. And the way that the international rules work is that coal we extract doesn't count in our emissions, so, you know, don't worry, we'll blame China when they burn it. But we're going to get rich selling it to them, and, well, we won't, but, you know, Clive and Gina will. Well, sorry, I'm not even being flippant, that's just the way it works. But yeah, so we in Australia are going to facilitate this problem, and then when they buy it off us and burn it, we're going to point our fingers at them and say, can you believe the Chinese? You see all the pollution they're making. Isn't this terrible? What are they going to do? And by the way, what are they polluting to do? To produce stuff. And who are they selling it to? To us. We've outsourced the polluting bit. We sold them the pollution, and we bought the stuff, and we blame them. So, what do we do about that?
Gee, that's simple. I mean, it's always been a sort of this, you know, hard to understand concept, you know, that Australia can just keep throwing out more coal, and then putting the blame on China for not doing enough.
Block Newcastle and Gladstone ports.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, there's some sort of, something's not fit, you know, clicking in the psyche.
But I guess, you know, is it too much of a distraction to say that the Kyoto rules and the Kyoto accounting framework doesn't actually work either politically or scientifically? Because I think, you know, 20 years ago, and we all knew far less about it then, but 20 years ago people didn't really think it mattered whether you impose the obligation on the buyer or the seller. And the economists, my dear friends, we all thought, well, there'll be much better data on the people who burn it, and it'll be hard to figure out the emissions in who buys it. So given that we don't really care, why don't we do the thing that's easier to measure? But what we've done, I fear, is create a political impossibility. You know, that now we've got rich countries blaming the poor countries for making the cheap stuff we buy off them. And funnily enough, the people the poor people in poor countries that are making the stuff really don't feel they've got a debt, you know, to pay to us. So I guess my question is, given how unsuccessful we've been in the existing framework, would it be a complete waste of time to try a different framework, or would it be a complete waste of time to stick with the framework that hasn't worked?
don't give me much of an option there.
How best should we waste our time then?
No, look, I think, you know, the Kyoto Protocol recognised that industrialised countries had to make the first step, and we set up an architecture for that first step to take place. We do see this sort of concept of leakage, where we're seeing, you know, the fact is that now we're seeing a lot of pollution going on in other countries not bound by the Kyoto Protocol. And we were arguing that the Kyoto Protocol should be expanded. The architecture, form of the Kyoto Protocol should be embraced by all major emitting countries, and that you have this verification system. You do have a compliance system. You do give allowance for this equity problem issue. You know that major emitting developing countries also have a development path that they have to move towards. And I think in this whole process, you know, South Africa is sort of treading a sort of middle ground on this issue, and they were supportive of a new legally binding agreement as long as there was recognition of their need for development. You know, and they came up with this sustainable development policies and measures concept, where they say, you know, we've still got major poverty, we've still got a large part of our percentage of our population that don't have access to electricity. And that's one of our major priorities. We want to bring electricity to households as a major development objective. But we want to bring, you know, clean electricity to those households. And that's how they see this sort of sustainable development pathway. And so South Africa was weren't sort of lining up with China and India, and was sort of taking a sort of middle ground and saying, yes, we do need a broader legal agreement to deal with climate change, because we're suffering as well. And they're a major coal exporter as well. So, you know, I think of the sort of major developing countries and the major emitters, they had the most progressive viewpoint on this issue. So I think we can work on the architecture that we have already. It's no point inventing something new, because the new system is what the US wants, which is just pledge and review. We just throw out a number and we just sort of think, well, let's see whether it works or not. Yeah.
Right, we've probably got time for one more question. Yeah, just here in the middle.
Just in terms of, you mentioned that California has taken up an ETS, and what I wanted to ask is if you think that's going to have much of a trickle effect within the United States. And the reason I ask is that I've heard that, sorry to be vague, but a small number of cities around the world produce like something like 90% of the world's emissions. And there are some ideas going around that you, rather than working at a national level, you go to cities and try to change cities and let that change the world. So I'm just wondering, do you think California is going to start changing the world?
Well, I think that's a positive way forward, and that California was the leader in lead in fuel. You know, it introduced restrictions on lead in fuel, and that flowed through to the rest of the United States. And there is a hope that this cap and trade system, once it's seen to be working, you know, and dealing with it, because they've got problems of air pollution, so it's in their interest to deal with it, that there will be this sort of flow-on effect. There are 3 provinces in China now that are piloting emissions trading scheme. Whether they'll be able to trade amongst themselves or not is another thing. You know, and Australia's looking at its own emissions trading scheme. Now the current government says it wants to buy 50% of its emissions reductions offshore, which sound a bit dodgy to me because it's some of the things they want to do with it. But I think you're right, is that maybe we've got to pick off the sort of major polluters and start developing schemes for them, and maybe they can work amongst themselves. You know, and can we have fungible trade amongst sub-national entities? And there's certainly people thinking about that.
So, I mean, for example, for Tuvalu, rather than trying to engage globally, like nationally with other nations, actually engaging with cities, do you think that's a strategy that's...
Yeah, well, I mean, it's such a small country. I mean, we have to have faith in a UN system that all countries are going to do something. We don't have the capacity to engage in discussions with like California or whatever. So within those, the Environment Department of Tuvalu is only 4 people. So there's a limit to what we can do in that regards. But where we can promote sort of initiatives that are going on around the world, it's a way forward, and I think that's a good idea.
All right, well, it's good that we finish on time, but please feel free to stick around and have a beer, and please join me in thanking Ian Frost.